Hey class, this is my week 5 assignment going over a question from each of the sections um, in chapters 11, 12, and 13. I wanted to start out with chapter 11. The question I'm going to be answering is, what are the major themes of the book of Joshua? So in our textbook we can find the themes of Joshua, and I wanted to quickly hit on those. First one being, this is a book about Joshua's kind of transition of power. We know that Moses was leading the Israelites into the Holy Land, but we also know that Moses was unable to enter the Holy Land, so therefore he needed to anoint someone, pick someone to kind of be the person who are in charge of the Israelites, kind of their leader, this person that is going to be leading them into this new beginning, and that happens to be Joshua. So Joshua is chosen to be the leader of the Israelites going into this new land, and I can just imagine Joshua. If I was in Joshua's shoes, I would be very, very nervous, if I was being honest. You're about to lead this group of people into this land that God has promised you, without the leader that has been leading them throughout this whole thing. You're kind of being thrown into the fire, so to say, baptized by fire. And as we read on in the book of Joshua, there's a lot of things that happen within the first couple of however what the time frame was, month, days, years, whatever. But there are events that happen that really kind of test Joshua's leadership, and really stretch him, and really stretch his faith too. How he listens to God and obeys his commands. This is also just kind of a really pivotal moment, I think, in the story of the Israelites. This is when they're entering into their new land, but they're also gaining a new leader. So it's one of those stories in the Bible that's very pivotal. It's very almost foundational. I think the book of Joshua is super foundational, and I'll speak on that in a little bit. With the second theme being the conquest and division of Canaan. Like I said, there are events in Joshua that really kind of stretch who Joshua is and who he is as a leader. One of these is when the Israelites were entering the land, they had to first take it. So they had to fight to take that land. So Joshua, being the leader, was put in charge of that. And he had to fight, take over, win over the land. Not only that, he had to then kind of divide the land. Now the Israelites, I think it's really easy to picture the Israelites as kind of not like a small group, but not like a civilization, which they kind of were. It was a bigger group of people. So he had to take that group of people, the Israelites, and he had to place them in places, because they couldn't just all live in one spot. So he was in charge of taking the land, but then kind of dividing up the land and giving the land to certain people. Again, really, as a leader, as kind of this leader who's being thrown into a situation, very, very telling of what kind of leader you are. You have two very big tasks right off the bat, entering this land that Moses is unfortunately not able to go into. But he does it, and he does it because of God, and that's kind of the third theme. That is God's faithfulness to his promise. It's interesting because when we, again, read Joshua, when we read the events, we hear that he takes over Canaan, he takes over this land. You think, wow, they must be really good fighters, and that's not really the case. God helped them through this all, just like he helps us today. There's a couple of verse quotes. 2 Corinthians 1:20 is thrown in there, but he keeps his promises to his believers. God promised that he was going to deliver Israel to this new land, and he does so, and he helps them with defeating and gaining the land. And it's, again, just one of those moments where we see God keeping one of his promises and fulfilling that promise to the Israelites, despite what they do. Again, they were on this journey, this prolonged journey, because they disobeyed God so many times. And yet, again, we see God at kind of the pinnacle of everything, at the climax of a story, come through and fulfill the promise that he has given to Israel. The promise that he was going to give this land, and he remains faithful to the Israelites. And that is the same for us today. God remains faithful to us. He keeps his promises to us as long as we are faithful to him. So yeah, Joshua kind of as a whole, those are the three main themes that we can find in Joshua. And there, again, like I said, this book is kind of really foundational to the Bible, but also to the next coming books. And I really like how the Old Testament is kind of set up that way. It's really, each book kind of works off each other. So it's really cool and really kind of interesting to see how that happens and how that progresses. My chapter 12 question that I decided to go through today is, how is the political situation of Israel best described during this period? I love Bible politics and how it works, and how we can look at Bible politics and kind of see similarities from today or a different period of time, but kind of seeing how politics work in the Bible and how they have evolved and changed and really kind of shaped a society. And we see that in Judges. So the political structure in the book of Judges, we have to first look at where the Israelites really are and who they are. This is a transitional period, as the book says. This is a period of time where the Israelites, they have made it into the Promised Land. This is kind of the starting of their society. We have to remember that when the Israelites were traveling, they were living in these tents. They were described as the book as a landless group of former slaves organized in a tribal society related to their family ties to Jacob. So it was really kind of this primitive way of living for the Israelites for a really long time, and they were living in tribes, and that was kind of their political landscape. It was very unstructured and kind of just everywhere. And now they're thrown into this land. They're in this land that is theirs. So they can kind of move away from that. They can move away from the tribal style of life and kind of form a more unified, more solid political landscape. But it isn't as easy as it is to say. We see that in Judges, that them settling was really kind of hard for them, because like I said, they were moving into this settled land as these landless people, and they were trying to figure out a way to build this political environment, and they just couldn't. They argued a lot. We see that in Judges. They argued. So as kind of everything started to kind of take shape, and as they got done, or not done, but they were beginning to form somewhat of a political landscape. We used to relate this back to the Greeks and how the Greeks' political system worked. It was a centralized area, religious area. For the Israelites, this would be the tabernacle. And then surrounding that is like the 12 different societies. But there are 12 different societies surrounding that central place. And we know that we have, for the Israelites, it's the tabernacle, and it has the judges all around the tabernacle. The book says that they used to compare Israel's political landscape to that. It's shifted now more today, which I kind of like the new way of looking at this. It says that religious and ethnic ties were probably the most important unifying factors during the Judges period, more so than the common devotion to a central shrine. It's saying that the book of Judges and the political landscape and how things were settled in the time period of Judges was really tied to religious and ethics. Kind of how, not kind of how it is today, it's actually very opposite from what it is today, but really how it should have been, I think. But it's hard because we know that the Israelites, they have a history of obeying false gods and maybe like worshiping a new religion. And we see that again. We see that the Israelites struggle, and they put their faith in a compromise because they see this Canaanite religion that looks really appealing, and some of them go towards that, and again it just kind of throws everything into turmoil, and it kind of messes up the landscape of Judges. But I think my biggest takeaway from reading this chapter and reading about the political landscape of Judges is that this was a transition period for the Israelites. The Israelites were really trying to figure out how to be a normal kind of functioning society in this time period, instead of being the society that's on the move for such a long time, living in tents, kind of living in these makeshift civilizations, and just again constantly on the move, and never really being established anywhere. And I can imagine that really plays a factor in how they couldn't really establish their faith. I think that the Israelites really struggled in establishing their faith, and that I think that kind of translates into them moving around so much. So we see them when they're settled in, they're still having those problems. They're kind of growing out of those problems, but we still see them. They still are affecting the Israelites negatively. They're disobeying God, and they're really kind of struggling in this period. But yeah, definitely my biggest takeaway was that the Israelites were really just transitioning, and they were really trying to figure things out. And again, all of this really ties back to us today, how we really are. If you are new to faith, or if you're new to following God, it is a transition period. It takes a while. It takes a really long time to kind of figure out who God is, and what your political landscape looks like when following God. And I think that whenever we read the stories about the Israelites, we can directly correlate that to our lives today. A relationship with God is the same as it is back then, as the same as it is today. And we see that kind of play out in the Israelite story. So I think this has really opened my eyes somewhat to how, not this specifically, but just the Israelite story, and how they have kind of dealt with politics and dealt with God, has really opened my eyes to what a relationship with God should look like. How it looked like back then, but also how it looks like now, and how similar those two things are. Just some technology changes for sure. But yeah, though it has been really eye-opening to read about the Israelite people as a society, and then comparing that society to myself today. The next and last question I want to address is, what are the basic themes or theme of the book of Ruth, excuse me. I think I said in my first video that this was chapters 11, 12, 13. This is actually chapters 11 and 12. Judges and Ruth are thrown into one chapter. But the book of Ruth is really cool, and I wanted to address the theme because I think the theme of this book is something that can be carried on no matter what time period we're in. We learn about the characters of Ruth. We learn about Ruth, Naomi, and then Boaz. And it's kind of this really weird family dynamic that we learn about. But really the main theme of the book of Ruth is about, our book says, a sovereign work of God in the lives of an unassuming, humble people during the Judges period. This amazing story tells how God blesses a faithful family from Bethlehem in a surprising way during a period of total moral chaos and confusion. There's two really big things that stand out to me when I read that. There's one, the unassuming, humble people, that kind of aspect of the theme, and then also this environment of moral chaos and confusion. The reason why unassuming, humble people sticks out to me is throughout the Bible we see God doing this. Throughout the Bible we see God taking people that you look at and you're like, there's no way that person can do anything good in this world, and then God using them and ultimately changing the landscape of Christianity, of religion, of whatever it may be, of the people of that time period. I think the biggest example for me is David. He's this shepherd's boy who's out there in the fields taking care of sheep, and he then becomes this king, and he rules so many different places. And it's again this like started from nothing and now is the highest place you can be as a person on this earth during this time period. You see people like Paul in the New Testament, who is a person who doesn't even believe in the stuff that Jesus is teaching, and then he goes from that and has this amazing encounter on the road to Damascus, and then turns into arguably the best prophet we see in Scripture, and he changes the whole landscape of the Christian community and the Christian religion, and we see those things in our everyday life. And I think it's still true today. I think God still uses these people that we just don't think about God using. In my head, if I was wanting to choose a person to represent Christianity, I think my first thing I would think of was like, who's the biggest celebrity? Who's the person that gets seen the most? Who is the person who has the most followers on Instagram or whatever it may be? But God doesn't do that. God does not think that way. He looks at the people who are unexpected, he looks at these humble people, and he uses them as tools to grow his kingdom. And I think it's just such a really cool dynamic. And it's something, as a person who works with kids, is I try to instill in them a lot. I try to instill this idea because, like, you don't have to be perfect. I think there's a big issue right now of self-image and how it affects kids today, but how kids look at self-image and think that's the most important thing. But here in Scripture, in the book of Ruth, it's not directly talking about self-image, but it's talking about these people that you look at and you're like, there's no way. But then God proves us wrong and says, no, there is a way, watch this. And he blesses these people. And then in the second thing that I was talking about is, the thing that stands out to me is God blesses a faithful family from Bethlehem in a surprising way during a period of total moral chaos and confusion. To say that we're not living in a society of total moral chaos and confusion, I think would be a lie to ourselves. I think today's society is very just kind of chaotic. There's a lot of just noise everywhere. I use the word noise as like there's a lot of news and there's a lot of opposing ideas and views and theories, and you hear those from entertainment, TV shows, movies. You see it on social media. You hear it in songs and in music, and just talking with everyday people, and you hear all of these things, and it's kind of chaotic. It's very can be blinding. It can be distracting, and there's really, you look at a lot of people and they may have no moral compass, or their moral compass looks a lot different from ours because we have a specific moral compass that has been given us because of God and because of the laws that God has made and because of Jesus and what Jesus has done. And I think that, again, this is a book in the Old Testament that if we look at it and say, like, this does not have a purpose, I think that's just flat out a lie. I think if we read the book of Ruth and really pull those and, like, make those connections of how this affects our lives today, I think we can learn a lot. I think just reading about a family who is blessed in the midst of moral chaos and confusion that we read about in Judges, continued on in Ruth, I think that it's very similar to how God is still blessing people today. He's still blessing you. He's still blessing your neighbor. He's still blessing your church in the midst of this moral chaos. And I think that if we ever come to a point to say where there's no moral chaos, we've made it, and everybody's been baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, go us. But if we don't think that there is moral chaos, and I think we're just blinding ourselves to that. I think it's something that we need to be aware of, and it's something that we need to always be diligent in getting ahead of. There's no way to stop it, really, because people are going to do what people are going to do. But God can help us through that. God helps the characters in the book of Ruth through that moral chaos and confusion. So yeah, I wanted to pick this question because I think that its ties to today, and how the book of Ruth ties to today, is really cool and really interesting. And I think that it's very valuable, and it's definitely something that I'm going to use a little more. I think I want to study it a little more, kind of really understand the whole story and the whole family dynamics of everything. But something that I want to use to teach and use to create parallels, I think, to our lives in the Old Testament. But yeah, so this is my week 5 assignment, going through chapters 11, 12, both Judges and Ruth. And that is it. Sorry, I was looking at the questions. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an amazing day. Bye.